Hello and welcome to our second behind the scenes online event. I'm Dr. Janet Sumner, a scientist and senior fellow media here in the STEM faculty at the Open University. For a long time though, I worked in the OU BBC Partnership Unit. The Open University has been making programmes with the BBC and in partnership with them for over 50 years now, at first transmitting our courses through the medium of television, but since our teaching went online and digital, we've continued to make a series of co-productions with the BBC in the area of television, audio, digital and social content to extend our public reach and engagement. Today's event celebrates the latest in that long-running partnership, Greta Thunberg, A Year to Change the World. This series has followed climate activist Greta as she's taken a year off school to explore the science and economics of global environmental change. In the words of Lord Reith, the founder of the BBC, why do we broadcast? To inform, educate and entertain. Because of the Open University BBC partnership, we are in a unique position to examine how you fulfill that brief with a subject that is so controversial and so mired in politics as climate change. In the past 3 years, Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg, has become, if not quite a household name, at least the young girl who is widely recognised as a schoolgirl who's encouraged young people to take action, to be seen and to have their voices heard, and to demand that world leaders fulfil their promises to take action on climate change. I'm joined by Open University academics who've been involved in the series and BBC producers as we go behind the scenes to take a more in-depth look at the science, economics and innovations of climate change, and to really unpick the delicate balancing act that goes into presenting the facts without getting bogged down in all the politics, misinformation and fake news that surrounds this subject. Right, I've set the scene, so let's meet our experts and find out more about Greta Thunberg, A Year to Save the World. I'll be talking to each person in turn and we'll have a question and answer session at the end of this, but you can start sending your questions into the chat box now and we'll try and pick up some of them as we go along. I have with me Professor Neil Edwards, expert in Earth Systems Science and Climate Modelling, Dr. Emma Dewberry, specialising in design for sustainability, and Professor of Environment Policy, David Humphreys. From BBC Studios, I have Rob Liddell, one of the exec producers, and Joe Myerscough, the series director. Welcome to all of you. Neil, I'd like to come to you first. Now, you're an Earth systems scientist. So what does this series teach us about climate change as something that's affecting the whole Earth system?
Well, one of the things I really love about the series is the way it does take that whole Earth system perspective, and you can see how climate change really is affecting the whole system, but also how those impacts are connected. So for instance, we hear how warming of the surface ocean is actually creating stronger Atlantic storms and hurricanes, and how that amplified warming that you get near the polar regions is leading to melting glaciers and ice caps, and that actually reflects less sunlight and therefore accelerates that warming. And then in those boreal forest regions, that allows this bark beetle pest that we see in one of the episodes to be wiping out huge areas of forest. Then you have drier areas where there's drying and those stronger winds that are creating perfect conditions for enhanced fires in California. Then you have the impacts on the human system as well. So those fires, terrible impacts on the local communities in California, but also wider impacts on the economy, and then the job losses you see with the Polish miners, and even impacts on politics in the compromises that have to be made in somewhere like Copenhagen. And what I love is the way Greta is really immersed in that physical climate change herself, in that incredible Atlantic crossing, just experiencing those hurricanes, those Atlantic storms.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your expertise and your involvement as an academic consultant, given the kind of stellar cast of scientists that were already in the show?
Yes, well, I started as a mathematician, but then I got really excited about whether we can build computer models of the whole Earth system, and that developed on into actually thinking about climate economics and how climate impacts the whole system, as I say, and the human system too. So our job at the OU was really just providing that check that what's said is absolutely true and accurate. And yes, there was this fantastic science chorus that was, you might think we had nothing to do, but in fact, it's terribly easy, horribly easy to take those many hours of interviews that the team would have had, but when you cut those down, slice those down, and recreate just a few minutes of interview, you can start off with something that's true and end up with something that's just not in context and not accurate. So if I take one example, we spoke to the Danish professor who had this additive that allowed the cows to stop producing methane overnight, literally. So they eat this altered feed, and the climate changing methane is reduced. Now, in the early cuts we saw, that came over that we could actually reduce methane emissions globally by a huge factor just overnight. And of course that's not true, because you have this scientific development, but then you've got masses of R&D, you have to find a business model to roll out that solution, and regulatory changes. So there are many years in between actually making that scientific discovery and actually being able to change those emissions at a global scale. So another example was the tree planting. So tree planting is really seen as a solution to climate change, but in fact it's much more complicated than that. And that's a real issue, because when you plant trees, that disturbs the soil, and that can actually lead to carbon loss rather than carbon uptake. And the conditions under which you actually it's good and positive to plant trees, as opposed to actually, for many years or even decades, doing the opposite thing in terms of letting out carbon instead of drawing it down. It's a very difficult question. It's a very active area of research. So in the final cut of the series, the wording was very precise, that just those were the results from that particular experiment, and not extending that. So there are many other examples which I think some of the others might pick up.
Thanks. We'll leave it there, and I'll come to David next. Actually, I'm guessing, David, you were keeping quite an eye out for the social science elements of the series.
Thanks, Janet. Yes. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm a social scientist. I work in the Faculty of Arts of Social Scientists at the Open University, and I first became aware of how humans are changing the global environment while backpacking through Africa and Asia in the 1980s, when I was able to view land degradation and deforestation at first hand. And that awakened a concern for me in the planetary biosphere and what we're doing to it, that eventually led me to a PhD in international environmental politics. So I kept a close eye on the social science component, in particular the relationship between the economy and the environment. And just as Neil said, just checking the subtleties and nuances of wording actually accurately capture the complexities at play. That's a recurring theme throughout the 3 episodes, is the relationship between livelihoods today and nature and the environment tomorrow. For example, we saw the climate strike in the oil-rich province of Alberta in Western Canada, which very much epitomises the heart of the problem between livelihoods and economic security. In Poland, we saw the Belkatał coal mine releases 39 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year, but to close that mine would result in the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. So there's this balance in the short term between looking after people's livelihoods and welfare, while at the same time being able to care for the future of the planet. And I think what this suggests is that a sustainable economic transition must provide jobs in the new low or no carbon economy, the green economy, for those who are likely to lose employment in the old high carbon economy. I think another thing that came through in the series is that the climate threat is, for many of us still, is quite distant. It's distant in time, in the sense that it's not happening now, it will happen in the future. And it's also distant in space, at least for many of us in the global north. The worst effects are happening elsewhere in the planet. They're happening in the tropics rather than the UK or Western Europe. So despite all the evidence, we're still not taking this challenge as seriously as perhaps we should.
Thanks, David. Now, I think you'll probably have appreciated some of the challenges that the BBC studio team faced in recording this series, because you've made films on climate change for the Open University. Have you got any stories from that?
Well, yes. I mean, some time ago, we made a film in Bangladesh about the consequences of climate change for the people and ecosystems of that country. Now, climate change, we found from talking to the scientists, the climate scientists that we met in Bangladesh, is leading to an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Cyclones blowing in from the Bay of Bengal push seawater onto the land and upriver. And once a storm subsides, the composition of rivers and underground aquifers has often changed from freshwater to saltwater. Now, this process is known as salinisation, and the saline frontier in Bangladesh is moving northwards and is likely to reach the capital of Dhaka by the end of the century. And this has affected the livelihoods of some of the farmers that we visited. We visited the village of Paitgacha in Khulna province in the south, which 30 years ago was an important rice growing region. But with salinisation, it's no longer possible to grow rice. Farmers have changed to growing saline tolerant vegetables and shrimp farming. We met several local farmers, including one gentleman called Nirapad, a vegetable farmer who fully understood the science of climate change and why his environment was changing. And he asked us to take home the message that the greenhouse gas emissions from the developed industrialised countries are affecting the livelihoods of people who've done nothing to cause the problem. So I promised him that his story would be told. After we interviewed him, we were invited to eat with his family, and we were treated very generously. It was a nice human moment. He's one of these people that's made an impact on me. I've never forgotten him. I remember after we finished filming that day, we gained an insight into how quickly the weather can change in this part of the world. We noticed in the distance an enormous, very tall bank of clouds on the horizon. It came towards us quite fast, and there was a sudden chill wind that grew stronger. We were then inundated in a torrential downpour, and a dusty earth road suddenly became very slippery and treacherous. So this was an interesting and at times challenging film shoot, both because of the conditions we were filming in, but also because of the difficult stories we were encountering on how climate change is negatively affecting people's day-to-day lives.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask more stories from the front line from Rob and Joe when I come to them in a minute. But for the moment, can you just talk very briefly about a term that was introduced called geoengineering? And I think that particular one was to do with injecting sulfur into the atmosphere and using that to reflect sunlight.
Okay, yeah, this is a controversial suggestion. I'm pleased the programme, the series mention it. It's not something we should be supporting. And here's why. We know that over long-term geological time, the Earth's temperature varies according to two sets of variables. The first is the amount of solar radiation or sunlight striking the Earth's surface. And the second is the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So, all other things being equal, the more sunlight hitting the Earth's surface, the warmer the planet, and the greater the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet. Now, geoengineering aims to reduce the sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface. And in theory, it can operate at three scales. The first is outer space, and the proposal here is that space mirrors could be placed in orbit to prevent solar radiation entering the atmosphere. This hasn't been done yet. The second, which is mentioned in episode 3, is injecting sulfates into the atmosphere. Now, sulfates are fine particles suspended in the air that reflect solar radiation and which thus have a cooling effect. And the third scale at which geoengineering can work is on the Earth's surface. For example, painting the roofs of buildings white would reflect more sunlight, just as ice reflects more sunlight, as Neil was saying earlier. So all these proposals aim to increase the albedo, or reflectivity of the Earth, in order to cool it. But there is a huge problem. None of them would reduce the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, which would remain dangerously high. So much of the carbon dioxide we emit is absorbed by oceans, making the seas more acidic, which poses a risk to marine life. And injecting sulfates into the atmosphere would increase the risk of acid rain. Overall, I think geoengineering would be a massive high-risk gamble. There's no natural analogue for a high carbon dioxide cool world. We simply don't know how the planet would respond to this new state. But the series did
David,
explore
sorry.
another.
I'm just going to interrupt there because being so controversial, we will talk more about geoengineering in the Q&A session, but I need to come to Emma now.
Thank you.
As a design specialist, you're interested in innovations that help us to begin to address climate changes, Emma. So if you could enlarge on that, please.
Yeah, well, finding innovative ways to respond to climate change is probably the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Dave just talked a little bit about geoengineering, and there'll be lots of things like that. I mean, we looked at episode 3 and talked about carbon capture and the technologies there, which are all really exciting and very hopeful. But of course, as Greta found, they need large scaling up. So I think a lot of our innovative responses at the moment are going to be a mix of policy, those new technologies, and also behavioural change. So our best approach for the foreseeable future is really thinking about how we can reduce those carbon emissions in the first place. How do we decarbonise energy systems? How do we rethink the infrastructure? How do we promote different behaviours? And design's all about that. How do we begin to try and think of those sorts of initiatives? And I thought it was really interesting because in episode 3, we also saw Dr. Jenny Stavrakov, who uses satellite data to indicate levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And she talked about the lockdown period last year, where I think we saw about 17% reduction in CO2 emissions during that first quarter of 2020, which was down on 2019 levels. And that's really interesting because, our industry stopped, most of the aircraft were grounded, we stopped travelling. It was a really big impact, and we felt it, didn't we? And it's like we only managed to reduce our emissions down to what they were in 2006. So that gives an indication of the sort of scale of change that we're looking at in terms of trying to reach these ambitious targets. How do we get to that 1.5 degree target that was talked about throughout the series? How do we dramatically shift to that level of doing things in different ways? And I think that's one of the big challenges, I suppose, is how not only innovation and technology allow us to do that, but obviously how we change behaviours to support that sort of action.
Now, you're not a climate scientist, Emma, but you sort of represent how wide the net has to be thrown, because it's not just about these innovations to do with particular products. Isn't it also about how the choices that we make? People talk about that one small thing that we can do, and we sort of looked at that in episode 3. So if you could talk a little bit more about how your design background feeds into that.
Yeah, so I think climate change can seem this enormous thing, so removed from our individual day-to-day stuff. And I think it's quite important that we find inroads into communicating to people things that they can do. And in fact, that was one of the things I focused on in supporting the programme, which was really, how can the open learn materials perhaps convey some of those individual behaviours, and also to give an insight into how designers might design differently to support that. At the moment, for example, we have product lifespans that are really short. I think the UK average for things like phones is like between 2 and 3 years, kettles 4 years, washing machines 6 to 7 years. I mean, these are far too short a lifespan really for the material and the energy and the emissions that are associated with producing these things. So we need to find new systems in which both production and consumption could be reimagined and rethought. And my experience, I suppose, as in design for sustainability is really to try and think about reimagining those ecological boundaries of products, rethinking how people can interact with them, communicating about how we might be able to make those things last longer, whether that's through repair or maintenance. And interestingly, while the series was, I think, being aired, the EU launched a whole new right to repair legislation, which is going to address producers to actually make sure that they have to allow their products to be repaired and maintained in different ways. And it can go a lot further than it has done. But I think this is a sort of small scale, everyday thing that we can be addressing, particularly from a design point of view.
Thanks, Emma. Well, there are loads of questions flooding in and people watching us, lots in the UK, but also Germany and as far away as Australia. So thank you to all of you for joining us. I'd really like to come to the production side of things now. So I'm going to come to Rob as exec producer, one of the exec producers on the series. How was this series different from other specialist factuals that you've worked on?
Hang on, can you hear me? Sorry.
We've got you now.
I hope you can hear me now. Brilliant. It was very different. We set out from the beginning to make this programme a hybrid between specialist factual science documentary and straight documentary. So telling some of Greta's story and giving insight into her was a really important element to the programme. But in practical terms, I think one of the really big differences for me as a specialist factual producer is that because of the nature of the way that we went about the series, we didn't plan every scene and work out the sort of thesis, if you like, of the series in advance. We knew roughly what we wanted to do. We knew there were certain key kind of topics and elements that we wanted to pick on, but very much we were led by what was going on in Greta's journey, both her physical journey but also sort of the journey through time that she's having over the year and a half we filmed with her. And therefore we had to be much more reactive to where she was going to be, what kinds of stories we could put together around that. So in many ways we produced we did most of the filming without a script, which is pretty unheard of for a series like this.
You developed something during the course of filming that you have christened the Science Chorus. Can you tell us a little bit more about them and the role that they fulfilled?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we wanted science to be the heroes of the programme. That was definitely something that everyone, including Greta herself, really wanted to be at the forefront. And one thing that we were very aware of from the beginning with working with Greta, and Greta herself was aware of, is that the constrictions around where we would be able to travel to tell our story. The normal approach, if you were doing this program with David Attenborough, you would probably take him to all sorts of different parts of the world to try and illustrate some of the things that you were talking about. But most of that would involve jumping on a plane and traveling to do shortish kind of shoots in different places. But Greta doesn't fly, as is, she's famous for. And we knew from the very beginning, therefore, we wouldn't be able to tell the whole story that we'd want to tell just by filming scenes that we did with Greta. And so that's where the idea of a science chorus, which was, interviewing some of the world's leading climate experts from around the world, came from. But also, we very much looked at the scenes that we did with Greta were always by inherently specific scenes. So, one that springs to mind is an early scene in program 1 is her on the Athabasca Glacier in Canada. And what we really wanted the series to do is to be able to branch out and jump to a global perspective, because all of the things that you look at are in the end examples of phenomenon that play out across the world. And so the science chorus allowed us to take those concepts and explore how they play out on a global perspective, but also explore some of the consequences that aren't immediately obvious in the location that we were. And in that case, actually, not only were we able to look at the sort of global impact, global volumes of ice that are melting, but also some of the human consequences to that, in terms of the effects on people downstream of these glaciers that we weren't able to film there. And one little thing I'd say about the science chorus is that I found it very successful and very compelling, and it's actually quite. It's one of the few things that the changes that we had to make to do with COVID that I thought was really positive, that allowed us that I would like to continue with, is that because we filmed that actually, during the pandemic, those elements, we filmed that towards the end of the production. We weren't able to travel at all. So we would hire local teams and do it over a kind of Zoom link. And what that meant was, which is, quite unusual for us, is that we were able to go to far more places to find the right expert to talk to than you would with a normal TV production budget. Normally you would be able to go to a couple of countries potentially to pick up interviews with those experts, but we were filming with people in Bangladesh, Singapore, the Caribbean, America, across Europe and so on. And so I think we ended up with a really great spread of people.
That's brilliant. We could come back to more stories if we've got time in the Q&A. We always like to hear behind the scenes things, but I really want to go to Joe next. But first to say, thank you for referring to the scientists as heroes. So, Joe, series director, what were the challenges of working without a script? It must have been terrifying.
It's terrifying in one sense. It's really exciting in another, because you feel, when you're making a TV program, you always want your presenter to be experiencing things, or your contributors, the people in your program, to be experiencing things and asking genuine questions. And there's a danger, of course, that if you've planned it all very carefully in advance and they actually really know all the science already, that can sometimes feel a bit stilted. So we have this great opportunity that actually what Greta is discovering, most of it is for the first time, and most of it even behind the camera. We are talking to these experts and we are learning a lot from them. Picking up on what Rob said, it was a very opportunistic way of working, because you have this sense of, well, Greta's only going to be in North America for a few weeks. We've got to do something now. What are the best stories we can tell here? Or, we did very genuinely get a phone call from her going, I'm in Belgium and I've nothing to do, like, for a few days. Like, is there any stories we can go? And so we ended up traveling to Switzerland and talking about the direct air capture there. So you had these, it was exciting in the sense that we just grab opportunities. And that extended through COVID as well, because the problem, of course, with COVID is those opportunities became fewer and fewer and fewer. We did a lot more stories in Sweden. But then we also had these plans that we really wanted to talk about agriculture. And we thought, well, ideally we'd go to Denmark. And so we'd have days of constantly refreshing the Danish government website to see whether it was possible for Swedes to even travel to Denmark. And then suddenly it was, so we all jumped in a car and went, right, we're going to a Danish dairy farm. And it's terrifying in times, but also quite an exciting way to make a program.
Yeah, and just a brilliant, set of programs that came out of it. So just reflecting on what Sir David Attenborough said about Greta being the voice of a generation in the course of going to capture these stories, did you feel that hers was a voice that was being listened to, being heard in terms of getting access to very important people?
Yes, I'd say it was. I mean, there's a huge intrigue from a wide range of people who want to meet her because of what she's already achieved. And someone like David Attenborough, they've been wanting to meet up for ages. So it was, a real joy for us to sort of just be able to facilitate that and be allowed to film it. I think Greta herself has developed this amazing sort of sixth sense for who's looking for a photo opportunity, who wants to be photographed stood next to someone with a load of Instagram followers, and who is actually genuinely interested in her perspective and the wider perspective of the youth climate movement. And she's very perceptive with that. So I think we got a really interesting mix of people in the series who very much wanted to engage with what she was saying. And even someone like, Angela Merkel, who Greta was quite amusingly dismissive of in some respects in the third programme. She met with this group of climate activists for 90 minutes. Now, okay, it was behind closed doors. We don't know what they talked about. But for someone of her stature to give a group of teenagers that much time shows that actually she saw a value in that. And she must have seen a value in listening to what they had to say. Now, what she will do with that information, who knows? But I think there's enough people interested in engaging with her genuinely.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. How difficult was it to get people to talk about the climate crisis when we're already dealing with a global pandemic?
I think there was an initial phase where that was very difficult, when we were really in the midst of that first lockdown. But then we were in a similar situation. We weren't sure, what we wanted to do or whether, what could be filmed or what was possible. But I think when that sort of passed, the appetite, certainly from the people in the film, was this is actually a great time to talk about climate change because we've been through this horrific, devastating thing as a species, and we've got this other potentially horrific, potentially devastating thing on the horizon. And people really wanted to talk about the parallels. For someone like Greta, she's been saying for years, you should treat a crisis like a crisis. And people, even me, admittedly, have gone, well, what do you mean? What do you mean a crisis? And now she's got something she can point to and go, that's what a crisis looks like. That's how you respond. Now, she's not suggesting we respond to the climate in the same way we responded to COVID. But what we all saw there was that you can have massive social change very quickly and on the scale akin to the scale of changes we'd need to seriously address the climate crisis in her eyes. So there was suddenly lots of people did want to talk about those parallels, what we'd achieved with COVID, what we'd achieved with the vaccine, and how there were sort of lessons to be learned. Obviously, there's no silver lining to something as horrific as COVID, but there are things that we can take forward. So I think lots of people were really keen to talk to us and say, well, let's make sure that we keep talking about this subject, even though we've had this devastating thing for the last year.
Thanks, Joe. Gosh, the questions are piling in. So I am going to throw it open to the floor. Now, some of these questions we're in danger of getting hung up on, and we could spend the entire half an hour discussing one question. So my lovely contributors, I'm going to ask you to keep your answers as brief as you can so we can get through as many audience questions as we can. I've got a very specific one first for Emma, which is about designing for sustainability, the level to which that is required. Is it economically viable? Is it something that we can do? Can we design our way out of the climate crisis, Emma?
Yes. Is a simple answer. I think a lot of what we're talking about in terms of some of the, particularly the sort of product and infrastructure designs, are actually about efficiency. It's about using less stuff and using it more wisely. So economically, that's not a challenge. I think the issues are about political will and about how we think about those infrastructural changes, those product changes, because actually what it boils down to is not the design of stuff itself, it's the actual ability to implement it. And that is about changing those systems of product consumption, thinking about the boundaries of those systems, thinking about it actually links to things like our productivity and how we equate economic development to ideas about material throughput in the economy. So these are actually very big, challenging issues which need to be dealt with as part of the policies associated with climate change. The actual designing of stuff, we know that. We know the technologies, we've been talking about it for 30, 40 years. There's a lot of things that we could implement that have just been a slow burn, and we haven't got around to doing it well.
I've got a production question here, actually, for Joe and Rob, and it's partially related to the COVID situation. So, Joe, Rob, how did you get involved in the series? And can you see the use of local production crews on the ground in places that we can't get to recently because of COVID? Is that going to become a more important part of filming than just shipping out our BBC studio teams as we do so often for these big series? It looks like, over to you.
It's very it's not a straightforward answer to that. I think that there are certain circumstances where using local teams really does work, and as I said, I think the Science Chorus element to that is a really good example. But it's when you're making these films, you're building an entire kind of creative architecture around it, and that's often about a camera and sound team and a director working closely together, and it's not something that's so easy just to port across to different people you hire on different days. So I think there still will be teams traveling out together to these locations, but I think we'll ask ourselves those questions. Maybe the bar for how that happens in the future will change a little bit.
Okay, let's get on now to some of the big questions. Question from Paul Mason. What would you consider to be the most challenging aspect in the battle to secure a much greener planet? Goodness me, who do I go to first on this one? Neil, I will come to you.
The biggest challenge? Well, I think that the biggest challenges are political. So getting leaders to buy into the regulatory changes and the political changes that need to be made. But of course, politicians respond to what the public wants. So if the public is sending a signal, business has already been sending big signals to politicians for a long time, saying we want the change, we want security, we want to know what the future is for our products, so we can do the kind of design that Emma's talking about.
Okay, so David, I'm going to ask you for your thoughts on that then.
Yes, Neil's right. The political obstacles are huge. We really need government on board to catalyse spending. And one of the things we've seen during the pandemic is that governments can find the money to deal with crises that are immediate. They're in the here and now. We need huge investment, what's been called a Green New Deal, to enable the transition from the old sort of fossil fuel economy through to a new clean green economy. That's certainly one of the challenges, and I think things are looking good for that with the election of President Biden, because we're seeing a high level interest in dealing with this problem that we haven't seen for several years. There's also a technological challenge, I think, how we generate the technology for this. I mean, we were talking earlier about the risk of geoengineering. But as we saw during the series, it did explore another proposal for intervening in the atmosphere, namely carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture. The projects that are examined were in Drax in England and in Himwil in Switzerland. Both good projects that are doing some good work. The problem is scaling them up to the degree and extent necessary to remove enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to cool the planet. And unfortunately, at present, we're a long way from being able to do that. So we need to continue research and development work on carbon dioxide capture and removal from the atmosphere to make the difference that we need.
Thanks, David. It's another production question, and actually it's for Joe. Will there be a follow-up episode, and was there any particular person or place that you didn't get Greta to interview? And that question is from Jodie Bettis.
Well, thank you. That's a really lovely question. Will there be a follow-up is a classic wait and see. We don't know. It depends who's interested. It depends if on many, many things. I think we'd like to. The big thing we didn't do, and this is in the series, is we had a very grand plan to go to China, and Greta very much wanted to go to China because it's just a fascinating place to go to talk about climate as, you know, as world's biggest single emitter as a country, but also a place where there is huge investment and huge uptake in renewables. It's a very nuanced sort of story over there, and there's lots of meaty stuff to get into. And we didn't go because there was a pandemic and there was no way on earth we were going to travel overland to China and South Korea and all these places. So I think in the back of all our minds, we secretly kind of love a chance to do that in the future. Maybe that's something Greta does either with or without us, but I think that would be the one I'd pick.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. So actually I'm glad you mentioned China, because that ties into a question from Martin Slater, who's saying, how on earth can we cope while there are countries who happily ignore vital issues and effectively negate more enlightened countries' best efforts? Surely there has to be a political intervention. David, briefly from you, and then I'll ask Neil to chip in as well. So very short and sweet.
Thanks very much for the question, Martin. It's a very good question. The role of China in international environmental politics is an important one. It's also a slightly ambiguous one. China's moved on from where it was 25 years ago, where it was introducing a new coal-fired station, every power station every week. It's still quite big on coal. But it's not increasing its coal use as much as there's been a sort of tailing off. China's a big investor in renewable energy now. It's a big investor in solar and wind, and it's also one of the few countries in the world that's undergoing net reforestation. So I think the answer to your question would be that there needs to be more engagement with China, because if it moves further towards low carbon technologies, it can make a massive difference. Thanks for the question.
Neil, can you come in as well, please? Thank you.
This is a really fascinating question for me, actually, because it's something we've researched on actively at the OU, modelling the global economy and how that the transition to a green economy develops around the world. And what we've found, actually, is that through the transition, you would think that countries that didn't make that investment into the green energy transition, could sort of free ride on the other countries, and they could benefit from improvement in climate conditions without having to pay for the costs of that. But actually the opposite is true. So we looked at, for instance, the US in particular, which at the time was not going in the very positive direction it is going now. And we found that actually if the US, and it's similar for other countries, didn't jump on the bandwagon effectively of the green transition as it's happening, they were actually damaging their own economy by, having more stranded assets. They couldn't produce the enough fossil fuel for their own consumption, and ended up importing it from other countries and actually harming their own economy. So it's actually in everybody's interests, and I think the politics that you see sometimes reflect these complex economics that are going on in the background.
I'm jumping around a bit here between science and production. So this is a question for Rob. So the science was very much centre stage, but it was also a story about Greta's journey. Did she learn anything about herself? And Claudia is asking, did you learn anything from Greta, or did it influence or change your opinions in any way?
Well, I think one of the things that has been really encouraging that we were able to do with the series is just to get to know Greta. And I think a lot of people see Greta in the news headlines. They see snippets of her like that, but that's not the real Greta. And I think what you see in the series comes closer to understanding the nuances and complexities of her life and her approach and her thoughts on all of these things. I was, she was very open with the filming, and very open to sharing some of the sort of more vulnerable aspects of her life. And I think that, I actually think that's one of the strengths of the series is understanding what drives a 16-year-old, as she was when we started, to effectively throw her entire life up in the air to campaign on this issue.
Yeah, those quiet reflective moments with Greta just alone sitting on the chair, they were very, very powerful for me. I've got lots of questions coming in about that one small thing, so I'm going to direct this question to Emma. Can you give an example of an everyday product that reduces environmental impact?
Well, there's lots of products around now. I mean, I guess one that's probably quite well known is the Fairphone, which is a phone that was sort of established probably about 5-6 years ago now, to compete in the mobile phone market. And rather than having a sort of system where it was trying to update itself every sort of 18 months and require you to buy into that and buy a new piece of hardware, it was very much focused on not only trying to work out its supply chain and make sure that the minerals and metals inside weren't coming from sort of conflict areas. So really try and think about the ethics of that supply chain and where things are coming from, but also to and enable the consumers of the product to be in control of it, to open it up, to be able to repair it, for it to be modular, for it to be replaceable. If the screen breaks, you can easily mend it. And that sort of sense of accountability and ownership for people to be involved in their product and take responsibility for it, and to have that access to what's inside it, I think is a really important way to go. And that has really significantly developed a sort of following, I suppose, of people that are trying to do something like a slightly counterculture to what we've already seen within the sort of mega phone industry. So I think that's a really nice example of a story that's sort of seeing things in the round, and design sort of going right the way from sort of extraction all the way through to sort of circular economy and capturing resources at the end of life.
Thanks. I have another production question, which I'm going to throw in Joe's direction. During filming, what partnerships did you see that recognised the need to avoid climate change robbing local people of income?
Oh gosh, I think I don't think we saw enough, to be honest. I think that's one thing where you really felt. I mean, we mentioned earlier the scene where she goes to meet some miners in Poland whose mine had closed down, not particularly as a reason of for green reasons, more for economic reasons, but their mine had closed, and you really felt for these men, and they really felt that they'd been left behind and they'd been abandoned, and their big fear was that this would happen not just to them but people in the next mine, in the next town, and the next town, and the next town. And I think there's a phrase that gets used an awful lot by activists, but by lots of people engaged in this, which is climate justice, which is about the fairness of this, that if we're decarbonising our society and if we're moving to new ways of doing things, that things should be done fairly and equitably. And I think that's a very good point. That needs to be a local issue as well as an international issue. I think the sad thing is we probably didn't really see enough of that kind of thing, of people being looked after and protected.
I'm going to go with a big question now, which I'm going to direct at David, and it's come from Paul Ross. Are the political issues so huge because the production of fossil fuels is what currently keeps existing infrastructures working? So that relates again to the mining story. Maybe you could start us there, David.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Paul. We have this dependence on a high carbon infrastructure of oil refineries and oil wells and petrol stations, and we need to transition to a different infrastructure, a different energy infrastructure that's based on low energy technology such as wind, solar, tidal, and so on. But, in order to affect that transition, I think we do need significant investment from government. The private sector is important. We've seen how the private sector can invest in solar energy and in wind-powered energy, but the private sector will only invest where the risks of them losing their investment are relatively low, and when the opportunities for a return on their investment, a profit in other words, are relatively high. And that leaves a whole area of activities where the private sector will not venture, but only government, only the state can enter. So yes, there is a sort of a lag, a sort of dependence, if you like, on these old energy infrastructures, and we need to find a way of transitioning to new ones as soon as possible. Thanks for the question, Paul.
Yes, a question for Neil. Any chance we're going to meet the Paris Agreement?
Yes, I think it's absolutely still possible. And the reason for that is that a huge amount of change, a huge amount of progress has already been made, but it's not always obvious. So, for instance, in the UK, our emissions as a country have fallen dramatically already, and that's essentially as a result of almost completely transitioning away from coal. So, for instance, Drax power station that we saw used to be a massive coal-burning power station, but they're now burning wood, which has extracted the carbon out of the atmosphere already. So it's not emitting new carbon, but re-emitting carbon. So there's already been a huge change in energy generation. But that's not obvious when you turn on the light switch in your house, where that energy is coming from. But that's going to change because the changes we need to make now to emissions really require the public buy-in in a big way.
I've got a really big question now that actually came in before this session started, and I'm going to try and ask each of you in turn, and that is, should we be creating globally some kind of Magna Carta or charter to take action on climate change that everybody signs, and that, for example, Greta might present to the United Nations? So, David, I'll come to you first on that one, and then I'll go around the room and hear from everybody else.
Well, that is a big question. The short answer I'd say is yes. We've sort of been exploring during our discussion what we need to affect the transition to a sustainable society. We've noted the role of government, the private sector, but also the role of private citizens. So a forum that will enable private citizens to express their concern for the necessary changes that are needed to legal systems, to governance structures, to politics, economics and technology. That if that was to enable ordinary members of the public around the world to sign up to that, it could only be a good thing. And the emphasis on the United Nations General Assembly is a good one, because that is a forum with universal membership around the globe. And if that was to adopt a resolution to that effect, it would be very positive.
Good. Rob, I'm going to bounce over to you for your answer.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit boring, I'm afraid, and say I'm not sure that that's a question as a program maker that I can answer. Really, it's quite important for us in this kind of sphere that we remain impartial and we keep our journalistic independence. With the series, we've looked really carefully at fact behind everything, and whilst Greta puts an opinion, and other people, in fact, many of the scientists in the programme put their opinion, the programme remains very clear and neutral on its approach. And so I think that's for others, politicians and activists to engage in terms of whether that's something that should be done.
But would you sign it?
Well, I would keep that private.
Okay, Joe, what about then your thoughts? Well, not just from BBC Studios, but also, as an individual.
Well, they're kind of the same thing. While BBC Studios is my employer, I think I have to mirror what Rob said. It's we put this series together to say this is the science, this is what is fact, these are the things you can't really argue with, and then it's up for everybody viewing the show to decide what they want to do with that information, whether they want to become activists, whether they want to just turn it off and never think about it again, is entirely for them to do. I think there's a role, the closest I'll say to a personal view is what we kept coming back to when we were making the show was the IPCC reports and the Paris Agreement, because they are two things that, if you are searching for fact and searching for consensus and searching for truth, are quite remarkable. That such a huge number of scientists from so many countries with so many feelings and emotions all came together and said, look, this is what we think is happening, and put it in a document that you can read, you can download and say, this is what we think. There's never been that in human history, to my knowledge. And then for as many countries as came together and said, right, yeah, we recognize that. That's true, and we need to do something about it. In the Paris, in the Paris conference, again, that doesn't happen every day. So I'd always just direct people towards those and say, yeah, there's a place for big agreements, and they've happened, and they're remarkable. But it's not for me to say what people should do next.
Very proper indeed. I'm going to need to start wrapping up, so I'm just going to ask Neil and Emma briefly. Would you sign it, Neil?
I think my employer won't complain if I admit that I would sign it, but I would say it's realistically what's been said is exactly true. The realistic approach to this is the Paris Agreement, and it's been signed. 196 countries have signed it on behalf of the 7 or 8 billion people in the world, and now the job is figuring out how we can actually implement that. That's the hard work, and that's going on now.
Emma?
Yeah, I think I'd be interested. I echo what's been said, and I think signing something that relates to how we go about sort of implementing those agreements that have been signed is really important, and that happens not only at the global scale, but it's really important to think about it in a contextual way and think about the local and how individual citizens have a role to play in that process.
That's a really good note to end up on. And sadly, I am going to have to wrap up, although clearly we could go on discussing this for at least another hour or so. So thank you to all of our contributors for joining us and giving us this behind the scenes look. Thank you to all of us for joining us and sending your questions. We've tried to answer as many as we can. Now, if you want to find out more about the Open University's research in climate change, or if this discussion has made you want to perhaps study something in this subject area, or if you want to find out more about the Open University BBC partnership and the other programs we co-produce, you can find out information by following the links in the chat box, and you can also go to our website, Open Learn. But for now, I would like to thank all of you very much and bring this session to a close. Thank you.